Judges it? Affirmative. Grayson.
Yeah.
Enacting the affirmative plan will not bring you the advantages that they told you it will. In fact, it will provide you with very minimal growth for the United States economy, and to offset that growth, it will provide you with a substantial disadvantage that will lead to investment being undermined and a debt crisis that will result in massive, unprecedented tax hikes in the future. That's what they provide you with, and it's not worth voting for. That's what we're going to be taking a look at in this speech, the truth of these statements, through two reasons that the affirmative plan simply has not been justified in today's debate round. We'll start with reason number one of minimal growth. Minimal growth. So let's look at, we're going to have two subpoints under this reason. The first subpoint is subpoint A, rate unmet. Rate unmet. Now the affirmative team had a bit of a contradictory stance in today's debate round. My partner made the argument that given there's exemptions that the effective rate will be lower, and they said in the 1AR that we're only talking about a statutory 25% rate, that we can't be taking effective rates into account, just the statutory ones. However, they made the response that when you take effective state rates into account, it's 4.2%. So they made the argument earlier in the round that when we brought up that Pennsylvania has a 10% statutory corporate tax rate, that, well, we can't accept that. We have to look at Pennsylvania's effective corporate tax rate. But when it comes to the federal government, we can only look at the statutory one, not the effective one. The affirmative team has been changing their position here, contradicting themselves on whether we need to use the effective rate, what they actually pay, or the statutory rate, the one that's on the books. They haven't provided you with a clear, solid, consistent stance on how they meet that rate of 25%. And if they can't meet that rate, their plan is not justified. Well, let's go down to the piece of evidence from the Heritage Foundation about the 25% rate. Now, they basically said in response that they have a bunch of other sources talking about, saying that exact same thing. However, all these other sources were just saying generically corporate tax cuts could help the economy. The piece of evidence from the Heritage Foundation was the only quote they've read talking about specifics of what a cut to 25% would mean for the economy. And as the affirmative team said in their last speech against my first disadvantage, you need quantification or else something can't be considered in the debate round. And given this piece of evidence from the Heritage Foundation uses a flawed economic model, it cannot be considered because there's no quantification left, given the affirmative team is relying on an economic model that has been proven false in the past. The Heritage Foundation predicted that the 2001 and 2003 tax cuts enacted by George Bush would eliminate the entire national debt by 2010. That hasn't happened. Heritage was wrong, they're wrong again. Now let's go down to the second subpoint, which is subpoint B of no wages increased. No wages increased. Let's take a look first off at two critical arguments that the affirmative team failed to address in their last speech. Let's first off talk about the argument that my partner made about corporate debt. Now, the affirmative team made the assertion in their speeches, that in the cross-examination rather, that corporations have a lot of debt. My partner said, if that is true, then corporations are going to use the tax cut to pay off their debt, not increase wages. Unfortunately, this was not responded to by the affirmative team in their last speech, and I asked them to not bring up any responses to this in their next speech, given if they could drop all the arguments in the 1AR and then bring them up again in the 2AR, that would be uneducational, there wouldn't be any clash on the arguments. So we've seen that corporations that the affirmative team has accepted will either pay off the debt, or if there is debt, they will just pay off that debt with a tax cut. This will not go to workers in the form of higher wages. The other argument the affirmative team rather dropped is my partner talking about the affirmative team's evidence that corporations have been passing the cost of the taxes on to consumers. The affirmative team doesn't change how the corporate tax burden works. All they do is change the rate. This doesn't mean that corporations will suddenly take all the burden themselves and give all the tax cuts to the consumers and the workers in the form of higher wages. The corporate tax rate works in exactly the same way, in that the corporations will still be passing that burden on to the consumers. That means that wages will not be increased. They're still the tax cut will still be kept by the corporations for cash holdings and large profits. Now let's go down to reason number two of substantial revenue loss. Substantial revenue loss. Let's take a look at their responses. Their first response, one of the responses was about a drop in the bucket, and they said that there's no brink, essentially. That essentially there's nowhere we can tell where a fiscal crisis will happen. Well, according to a group of 80 House members writing a letter to the Joint Committee on Deficit Reduction in 2011, and according to Mark Zandi, PhD, the number that we need to stop a fiscal crisis, a debt crisis, is $4 trillion. The affirmative team takes us $1 trillion in the opposite direction. They make it 25% harder for us to solve this debt crisis. And as we saw, if that crisis comes about, it will result in massive, unprecedented tax hikes, the likes of which we've seen never before in order to evolve it. If you want huge tax hikes in the future, by all means, vote for the affirmative team. But if you want fiscal security, vote negative. Their next argument was about how it's $400 billion maximum. And however, I didn't agree to their numbers, I agreed to their math. Their math was saying that 1/4 of the corporate revenue gain will be lost. I read a piece of evidence that $4 trillion will be gained over the next 10 years according to the Congressional Budget Office, and cutting it to 25% reduces revenue by $1 trillion. So that's a fourth. I agree to their math, not their numbers. We've seen that the impacts are quantified. Investors lose about $1 trillion of money given the government borrows it from them, and we read evidence that a fiscal crisis will result in hundreds of billions of dollars being taken out of the economy and massive tax hikes. So I ask you to vote for the team of fiscal responsibility and fiscal security, which does not come with the affirmative, only with the negative. Thank you.